Welcome to the Healers Café, conversations on health and healing with Manon Bolliger, a retired and deregistered naturopathic physician with 30 plus years of experience. Here you will discover engaging and informative conversations between experienced healers, covering all aspects of healing, the personal journey, the journey of the practitioner, and the amazing possibilities for our own body and spirit.
So welcome to the Healers Café, and today I'm with CJ Williams, and he's got a very interesting path, and he started as a trader and then a headhunter in financial markets, and now he's really into inspiration and education to do with bringing consciousness and awareness, raising awareness in children of the environment. He's got board games, books, and all of this has been part of a healing process. And as you all know, it's a time where our connection to nature, to the environment, to all the animals and everything that's living on Earth really does matter. So welcome, CJ, and yes, feel free to maybe expand upon that journey, that because that's, it seems so different, and yet does it really need to be opposite? Maybe not. Maybe it's an integration. So I'm very curious about your journey.
Okay, thank you, Manon, and thank you very much for having me. It's good to meet you. Yeah, so my journey, as you say, I was a dealer in financial markets, and from there went into a second career, which was then recruiting for people that I used to work with, so other traders and salespeople within financial markets as a headhunter. Never particularly like that word because it's the literal definition of that is savage, but I guess that's partly does reflect the behavior in that particular industry. But as far as healing goes, I think one of the points I really wanted to get across and to speak to you about was I consider my own healing has really been part of the career changes I've made, because what I was doing was actually a very well paid job initially, where I used to have to get up in the middle of the night just to get there, and worked with people that I didn't particularly get on with, doing something that I didn't particularly enjoy, but it was very financially rewarding, and that's how I managed to put my own kids through school and college and feed and clothe them, and proud of that to an extent, but it always felt like a bit of a cop-out, because it went against the grain of what I'd been taught and believed, which was, what life should be about. And, I went to a Christian school when I was a kid, and I went to Sunday school, and, we had scriptures and assembly every morning where we were taught lessons about how to behave, and I always carried those messages throughout the day, and it stuck with me. And I kind of felt I was being a little bit disingenuous or not true to myself by not following what I truly believed in, which was do something you enjoy and what you're good at, which for me was always writing. It's something I've always been passionate about and loved, and also as a country boy, grew up in the countryside. I've always loved nature and always been very keen on wildlife and animals, and so really I guess I hit a bit of an aha moment or an epiphany, where it was, I now know what I can do to combine the two things I like best, i.e. nature and writing. And I can spread a message to the world, basically to kids, to teach the next generation about the need to look after wildlife and protect the environment, and the importance of that. And I can tell you a little bit more about how I reached that point, if you like.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting, because there's many people, especially now, that have either lost their jobs or, been coerced potentially out of their jobs, not always willingly, and they're searching, and it's a time. I think it's a very intense, some people say spiritual time. Again, I'm not talking about organized religion necessarily, but it's really a time for deep inner reflection. And often when we make these major changes, like what you did, um, yeah, learning what it took and what happened. How did you get through it? What instigated it, really?
Yeah, it's very interesting because, as I say, felt a bit lost in some of my previous jobs, because it's all very well, as I said, getting well rewarded for that. But if you're not happy, you're not enjoying it, you're not particularly motivated, it's not a healthy thing. And I guess I've been lucky to arrive at this point now where I'm doing something which I do really enjoy, and I think it's important and valuable, and to take a message to the world. I can tell you a little bit more about that as we go on, but I arrived at this point really by reading myself a real mixture of sort of eclectic mix of works by various people. And one of the people who inspired me is a crime writer, actually. He's an investigative journalist, hilarious guy who I'm sure you're familiar with, very popular guy, called Carl Hyacin. And he grew up in Florida, where he's passionate about the Everglades and his surroundings and what's been happening in that part of the world. But without going into too much detail about that, in one of his books, because as well as being a crime writer, crime as in crime capers really in Florida, but he has gone on to write children's and young adult books, and they are very much taking a message to the world about the need to look after the environment and protect wildlife. And one of the people he referred to in his books was a lady I wasn't familiar with, but a very eminent scientist going back to the 50s. She published works about this very subject as a conservationist and an eminent scientist. So say her name is Rachel Carson, who you may know. And he referred to the Silent Spring, which obviously, on his recommendation, as it were, I went out immediately and bought that book and read it and was absolutely hooked. And some of the messages in there really brought it home to me about this need and the lack, if you like, the lack of education our children do get in the regular, curriculum, to know more about this. And actually, as I've got more into it, I'm actually astounded by not only the lack of knowledge within children, but also adults as well, about animal species. Because my book, the first book is published now, and the second one is a work in progress. But there was also a board game I've released, and part of that is the junior part of that is a quiz about animals and their bodies, their habitat, their diet, and the threats and challenges they face. Mainly human perils. But the lack of knowledge when I've played it and obviously tested that game before launching it with adults actually astounded me. And because it's a passion of mine, and I've always been up to speed on the various animal species. I don't claim to be an expert at all, but there was just a real lack of knowledge amongst a lot of the people I test played it with. Anyway, that's another matter. But having been inspired by people like Carl Hyacin and then Rachel Carson, obviously Sir David Attenborough, who I think is globally popular now. He's taken a lot of messages to the world. His recent witness statement was all about, going into more renewables now rather than traditional energy. Reforestation instead of deforestation, eat less red meat, try and address the imbalance between the poor and the rich, and then also look after our oceans. So those kind of 5 key things I think are vital. And so here's something of an inspiration as well. And yeah, so that tells you a little bit about how I arrived there. But I think it was literally all part of a healing process for me, because coming from a background, originally going to a Christian school and having assembly every day where we had readings from the scriptures, and then those messages staying with you throughout the day, so you learn to behave in a certain way. I wasn't really happy in an environment where a lot of that was really disregarded or had gone out the window, and the behavior was a lot of the time not very Christian. So I always wanted to come back to doing something more along those traditional lines.
What is it that you found in the Christian education that you missed, that you felt were values? I mean, because it's all value driven on some level. What is it that you felt was missing?
I suppose caring, and caring in the sense of looking after and protecting, and really recognizing, I think, the interrelationship, the importance of that, interrelationship between all species, and the importance of that. And that message came home to me even more through some of the readings I did in later life. And the interdependency is the really important thing. And as I said, it is very topical now, and has become even more so. I embarked on this project several years ago now, so it's not as if I'm jumping on a recent bandwagon, but it has become increasingly popular, with the likes of Greta Thunberg doing her piece, which is important. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of a 16-year-old standing up and ranting at the world and telling an older generation where they're wrong, because that's not necessarily the way to get the message across. But it, anything helps. And I'm certainly not the first person to write literature, children's fiction, where animals are kind of humanized and given a voice. Beatrix Potter, I'm sure, has done it far better than I have, as has Rudyard Kipling and Walt Disney and numerous others. But it's a way I could get the message across. And I'm fortunate in that all the reviews I've had so far have been extremely positive. But more than that, I think a lot of them do stress the importance of the work in terms of, not enough's being done about this to educate kids. And the main point about the whole message is for children to learn about it whilst they're having fun. So to play a board game with their family is a positive thing anyway, because it gets them off the screens, which there's always
too much of.
Well, there's always parents who are keen for them to not come off modern technology completely, but to spend less time on it and to spend more time perhaps interacting with their families.
Interacting is one of the big things too, and I really picked that up when you're saying with animals as well.
Yes.
And if you look at animals as contributors towards all healing processes, we know that with dogs, we know that with cats, we know that with horses. There's all kinds of courses and trainings, where the animals can so help facilitate and aid people who have, anxiety disorders, PTSD, all of that. There's a deep knowing that there's an interconnection, but it's not, it's like you said, it hasn't been developed young or re-emphasized. I think, when we're young, we have that connection. It's like an intuitive knowing. Manon Bolliger here, and I want to thank you for taking actionable steps towards engaging your healing journey and helping others discover their path by watching, sharing, subscribing, and reviewing these podcasts. Every review and share helps spread the word, these different perspectives and choices and options for healing. And to thank you, I'd like to invite you to sign up to my free 7-sequence email tips on health and healing for everyday life. You can go to healerscafe.com tips. Thanks so much. That we're truly interconnected. And then we grow up and everything gets compartmentalized, and you start not seeing the unity of it all. Do you resonate with that?
Absolutely. And, I think that is a very, very important point, that, it's easily forgotten, especially when you're working in a kind of dog eat dog
world,
fast-paced environment, where some of those values do go out of the window. So I think that's absolutely true and massively important. And again, it's all part of this kind of journey, healing process and transition for me, from one career into another, and doing something true to your heart and hopefully getting the message across. And something I've learned along the way, I've met some really interesting people, because clearly in a project of this type, you can't do it alone. So bring collaboration with some very interesting people. I have a fantastic illustrator, for example, who I stumbled across, is a girl who's local to me, who I think is a genius. Another very, very important person for me is my editor, who I've met personally, love dearly. And she's not only an editor, because she's an author as well, but she has been invaluable. And she's someone who's led a very tough life, Marcy Pusey, who has taught me a lot. And she's a devout Christian, a therapist, and through meeting her and being encouraged to meet others within her group, I've met other people who have gone through much more healing than I could ever hope to achieve or want to, really. I'm talking about physically and spiritually and emotionally and all those things. And another one of those was Hal Elrod, actually, who I had the pleasure of meeting and listening to. And he, I don't know if you're familiar with him, Manon, but he was given up for dead, actually, at one point in his career, in his life, but also has, even since recovering from that very, very serious car accident, has recovered from cancer. And he's written a book which sells in the millions worldwide. It's The Miracle Morning, which again for me is something I follow devoutly now, and and it's hugely important for me. So all these people along the way, having embarked on something new, have all been part of the healing process, if you like, and the learning curve, the transition. But one of the things, coming back to Marcy, my editor, she said to me, "What do you really want to achieve from this first book?" And I said, "Well, look, any author will probably tell you that they ultimately would like to be top of the bestsellers list, or receive fabulous reviews, or make great book sales." And it is some of that as well, of course, but really, I said, at the end of the day, if one reader, one child, can become a zoologist or a conservationist, hopefully a marine biologist, as a result of being inspired by reading my stories, then that will be it for me. That I will be satisfied, so that will have sort of complete the healing process, if you like, from someone who has come full circle from being, like you said, naturally aware of the importance of nature and the other species and everything surrounding us, to going into a different world and then coming back again into recognizing the importance of that.
I wonder how it might be for children who are not really even shown nature, are not, have these parks that are barely have grass,
Yeah.
because they're trodden upon, and parents
Mm.
now who have to have two jobs to,
Yep.
to be able to survive.
Mm.
And, they're in cities, and I don't know how much they get.
I think it's a great point. And another part of the inspiration for me actually was I was astounded to learn that some kids, when urban dwellers, I guess, when asked where does milk come from, and it sounds a bit cheesy, but they literally say the supermarket, yeah, rather than knowing that it comes from a cow. That is the lack of knowledge you are you're talking about. And one of my longer term goals actually with this whole um, brand and project is to ultimately begin, launch and fund a charity, which will be called RACE, RACE, which is actually an acronym for raising awareness in children of the environment. And what we hope to do is to be able to take kids, who are maybe deprived or haven't got enough access to the countryside, into country parks and farm schools and nature reserves, and let them experience firsthand a little bit more about
especially in early childhood, if possible, because those are such the formative years. And it actually makes me or reminds me of a small story. But I had taken my youngest daughter to India for a conference. This is quite a ways now. She's a full-on adult anyway. But and it was a homeopathy conference, and we were talking about feline, the whole, like all of the tigers and the lions and all of this. And when I got back to her, I would explain to her the differences and the temperaments and how these different animals operate, and several years later, I found her once just crying in her bedroom. And I said, what's wrong? And she was sobbing and sobbing. And then she said, I can feel it, Mom. It's almost the end for the Bengal tigers.
Yeah.
And it was such a deep connection. It's like, I don't know whether it's the trip that had started her this connection, or whether she would have always been connected. I don't know. But, for her to have felt such a connection is, it's quite remarkable. And and now she's she's an animal lover, and she's actually starting her own farm. And so you can see that it sort of all connects. But I don't know if there's a pivotal time period where otherwise, is it still a longing? And for me, of course it is, but I had that privilege, how to get that early enough to create some connection to to nature, I think would be really important.
Yeah, I totally agree. And luckily for me, being brought up in the countryside, I was very lucky as a kid, I think, to be able to go to the local duck ponds, as they were, and be able to fish out great crested newts and study them, and then obviously return them to their environment. They're very much a protected species now, certainly in UK, I think in Europe. And to see them firsthand and know them and be familiar with them was a privilege. I also had another great experience as a child to be stalking, if that's the right word, not really stalking, but following a herd of local deer, of which there was an albino stag. And to get up close to that creature, an animal, when it was drinking from a pond in a wood without knowing we were there watching it, was another fantastic experience. So at a very young age, to firsthand witness things like that, for me, were very rewarding and stay with me. And another reason really why I want to to share that, or to allow the next generation to be able to experience such things as well. And hopefully some of my stories will do that. So the first book is Eyes to See Them is the title, and the second one is Wise and Wonderful, which is a work in progress now, and it's alphabetical, so there will be a creature from A to M in the first book, and then from N to Z in the second one, and each has its own particular story in terms of the threats they face in the world, and what we can do about it is actually the message. So hopefully that will teach kids, and they can start to do more themselves as time goes on, to be able to make sure we are looking after these animals. And the titles, by the way, are stolen from a well-known hymn that we used to sing at school, and I'm sure kids still do, which is All Things Wise and Wonderful.
Right.
And I couldn't have a couple of titles from that, because James Herriot with his work had already taken those. So I was able to find these other ones, but in any case, as I say, the board game is out there, it's on Amazon, and children do enjoy playing it, and hopefully again they'll learn something from that, and those messages will stay with them, and they can carry that forward, and it'll be a better world as a result.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you a very strange question just as we wrap up. But if you now, knowing what you know now and your own transformation and your reconnection to what you value in life and doing what you love, when you look at the whole finance world, if you walked into it now, knowing, being who you have become, because there's always movement, do you think that we could have a finance world that is much more aligned with interconnected values and all that? Does it need to be the way that you experienced it?
No, it's a very, very good question, and I think there is definitely hope there. And I'm still in touch with a lot of people from that world, and I've got some very, very good friends and ex-colleagues and associates and acquaintances from that market, and it is changing a great deal for the better, and there's much more emphasis now being placed on important human things such as diversity, but also sustainability and social responsibility, and all those factors. Now there's a huge amount of emphasis being placed on that, so it is it's definitely improving, and will continue to do so, I hope, and that applies not just to the big banks and the big fund managers, but also to a lot of the big energy companies and other industries where there is a real consciousness has been raised now, and hopefully we're making a move in the right direction, certainly when it comes to the big issues like global warming or climate change, whatever you want to call it.
Well, especially, if it doesn't get if it doesn't get co-opted by the politics, because there's lots of politics, of course, and destroying what otherwise is, I would think, common sense. We have to live in nature, it's not a battle against nature, and so there's a lot of fundamental changes that that I'm looking forward to anyways.
Absolutely, me too.
Okay, well, CJ, thanks very much, and if there's any last words you want to share, then
I'm not sure, I know you're very much all about healing, Manon, and I really enjoy your podcasts, and the messages that I get from there I think are valuable, and not so sure mine was so much about healing, but I feel I've gone through a lot of healing myself as part of this transitional journey into something worthwhile. So keep doing the good work, really, and spreading the message. But it's been very enjoyable, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you for joining us at the Healers Café with Manon Bolliger. Continue your healing journey by visiting thehealerscafe.com and her website, and discover how to listen to your body and reboot for optimal health.